I'll admit that I have a love-hate relationship with my dog. My wife was recently away for 2 weeks, and several nights the dog jumped up onto the bed and laid there beside me all night. And when he first did it, I was like, no, not happening. Get out of here, go lay down somewhere else. But toward the end of the trip, toward the end of the time my wife was away, 4 nights in a row he did this, and I actually appreciated it. There was a sense of comfort about it. But I have to admit to you, there are other times throughout the day where I could easily just be upset, irritated with the dog. In fact, I can summarize dog ownership with just a few words: shedding, pooping, peeing, barking, and fleas. Think to myself, I pay money for this? I pay money to feed and care for this, to keep this going. Well, I do. Because my kids love the dog. The dog has provided a richness of life for them and for our family. Still, it is amazing to me how quickly the irritated, bitter feelings can just erupt from inside of me. Especially when the dog erupts. I'm talking about when he goes outside, maybe he is eating some grass, comes back inside and vomits all over the floor. Oh my goodness. And my guess is that there are situations in your lives that are far more consequential than pet care. And they make you upset. It could be relational, financial, maybe a very serious health concern. The reality is that we are people who can become irritated and start complaining. And if so, today's study in the book of Exodus and the life of the nation of Israel is for you. Now, to review, the people of Israel in our study so far are now free from slavery in Egypt. They're also out of Egypt. Their oppressive Egyptian overlords, led by the Egyptian king Pharaoh, are no longer a threat. But that freedom doesn't mean that Israel is anything close to being settled, peaceful, or at ease. So turn to Exodus chapter 15, verse 22. This is what happens right after the astonishing miracle that we learned about last week. God's parting of the Red Sea and the people crossing through on dry ground. Well, now we read that Israel has been walking through the desert of Shur for 3 days, and this is the key point: they have not found any water. Now, my guess is that they began their journey through the desert with some water in reserve, and they're gradually drinking it, but did they use all the water in those 3 days? I mean, how long can you go walking in the desert without water? And so I wonder if any of them were starting to pass out, to have dehydration. Is it even possible that some have died? We don't know. But they come to a place where there's water, Mara, except this. They test it out. The water is bitter. We might call it brackish. And what happens? The people begin to complain and grumble. So interesting. There's a thematic resonance there. Bitter water leads to bitter hearts. Now, I read that phrase in the description when it says they began to grumble. I had to admit, it comforted me a little bit. The Israelites are behaving just like I behave sometimes. Just like we humans can behave. They have seen the incredible power of God through the plagues in Egypt, through the crossing of the Red Sea. They have seen God protect them through the pillar of cloud, the pillar of fire, the angel. And that was just days before. And yet, it's as though God's majestic power is ancient history now. In 3 days, that's all it took. I find that comforting. Why? Because it's so human. It's so like us. So how about you? Have you ever caught yourself complaining, grumbling, though maybe just days before, months before, you experience some wonderful blessings? Why is it that we can so quickly forget God's provision? Why is it that we can be ecstatic for God answering our prayer one moment, but complaining that He isn't answering the next prayer the next moment? Why are we so fickle? So think about your life. Have you demonstrated that fickleness, that human tendency to complain lately? Now, back in Exodus chapter 15, I want to ask this question. Shouldn't the Israelites respond to their desperate situation? And it is a desperate situation, by the way. No water. Shouldn't they cry out to God for help? I mean, shouldn't they, in a sense, joyfully pray to God, "Oh God, you are good. You are great. You are the God who has clearly demonstrated time after time that you have saved us from Egypt. Can you help us again, please? We need water. And if you choose not to provide, we will faithfully follow you anyway, even if we die." That is how they should pray. If they would have prayed like that, it would have been a lot like Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, who was about to face arrest and beating and crucifixion. And he says, "Lord, please take this cup," meaning this situation of that he knows is going to be horrible. "Please take this cup from me, but not my will, but yours be done." Now that's a bold prayer. That's a humble prayer. Israel did not pray that prayer. And often, I think you and I have to admit that we don't pray that prayer either. We grumble. This complaining, this bitterness comes out of us naturally, as if we're being treated unfairly by God, or if the world is out to get us. Well, when Israel does that, Moses responds by then crying out to God. Moses does the right thing. And God answers Moses' cry by showing Moses a piece of wood. I read that and I thought there has to be more to the conversation than that. Because all we read is that Moses takes the wood, throws it into the water, the bitter, brackish water at Marah, and the water becomes sweet. I don't know, maybe there's a kind of wood that has filtering properties that can turn the water sweet, but more likely, what we are reading here is a miracle of God. In fact, it might have actually been a demonstration of great faith on Moses' part. I mean, if God asked me to pick up a piece of wood and just throw it into some bitter water, I would be super skeptical. I might even be exasperated. I might have that complaining come out of me like, "Whoa, Lord, we've been walking in the desert for days without water. Stop playing games. Throw wood into the water? That's not how you filter water to make it pure. Lord, do something." But God had done something. He'd shown Moses the piece of wood. And I do think there was probably more to the conversation. How else would Moses know to pick it up and throw it into the water? But Moses does it. And my opinion is that God does a miracle at that point. He responds to Moses' obedience. And the miracle means the people no longer suffer thirst. That should tell the people something about God. Now, to make it very clear what has just happened here, God tells the people something about himself. Look at verses 25 and 26. He tells the people that if they listen carefully to him and do what is right in God's eyes, if they pay attention and obey him, he will not bring on them any of the diseases that he brought on the Egyptians. In fact, he says, if they obey him, he will heal Israel. Now, at this point, the people, at least we don't hear of any response. Maybe they're just too busy drinking water and filling up their water jugs. But we don't need to hear a response at this point, because God's heart here is not that they're going to respond with any kind of verbal commitment. God's point is, you will show me your commitment as you obey me in the future. It's kind of like when maybe you treat a family member poorly. Maybe you lash out at them with some mean words and you're unkind and you know it and you feel bad and you go to them and you say, "I'm so sorry," and they forgive you and you're restored. Then a couple days later you do it again. Same thing. Sorry, restoration. A couple days later, do it again. And the cycle repeats itself. How many times does it take until when you lash out at them and say you're sorry, they say, sorry? That's not going to cut it anymore. All they want is changed behavior. They don't want verbal sentiments. So, God wants the same from his people. He wants them to obey. I think that's so instructive to us. You know, our verbal sentiments are not empty. They're not without meaning. But it can become empty if it's not followed through with actions. If we say we will control our tongue, but we don't end up controlling our tongue, we'll have shown our true colors. So what will Israel do? What are their true colors? Will they actually listen and obey God? Well, we keep reading. They've had their fill of water, and we learn that the people next travel to a place called Elim. And there are springs of water and palm trees. Now, scholars tell us this interesting fact. The distance from Marah, where they had the bitter water and the miracle, to Elim, where there are springs of clean water, is likely 7 miles. You see what that means? God has been leading them to water all along. In fact, on day 3, without having water, when they were doing all their complaining, they only had 7 more miles to go. Now, when you hear that, 7 miles, I don't know if you think that's long distance, short distance, but say you are walking at a pace of 20 minutes per mile, and that's a fairly moderate pace that children can walk, adults can walk. 20 minutes per mile. It would take you 2 hours and 20 minutes to get from Marah to Elim. That's doable, I think. Even if they were exceedingly thirsty and having some dehydration, and maybe some people needed to be on carts or piggybacked, or they needed to take breaks, and it took 3 or 4 hours. We're not talking about an impossible feat here. What we see is this. God was leading them from a heart of caring love all along. He knew what they needed. He knew how to care for them, and he had the capability of caring for them. He knew they were thirsty. He knew they had just gone 3 days without finding water. He also knew plenty of water was just a few hours' walk away. In other words, God is trustworthy. The people should have placed their trust in him, putting their one foot in front of the other and following him fully or nearly fully. I mean, with confidence that they could trust in him to provide water. But back there at Marah, they didn't trust in him. They complained, they grumbled, they didn't demonstrate a hopeful trust in God. There are plenty of difficult situations in life where you and I can have a very similar response as the Israelites. Sometimes they're inconsequential situations, and I get them. Want to watch a football game and the signal's unclear. I want to work down in my basement or up in my attic, and in my house at least, the ceiling goes right here, so I have to duck down. And or it could be like I said with my dog, whining to go out when he just went out 15 minutes ago. Those feelings of grumbling and complaining come up so fast. And that's amazing as we read about God's reaction to the people. He was so gracious. They were 7 miles away from water. He could have simply said, "No, you're walking. We're 7 miles away. You can do this. I need you to trust in me." But he didn't do that. He bent down to their level and he miraculously changed the bitter water into drinkable water. God reminds us, and he reminds the people of his protection and his power, and that they can trust in him. He's so gracious. We have a gracious and loving God. And so let's nurture obedient responses to him. Let's strive to change our automatic response from grumbling to hopeful trust. Now, Israel is about to have another chance to practice this as we move into chapter 16. The nation sets out again into the desert of sin, not sin like wickedness or evil, but probably related to the geographical location of Sinai. And we learn that some time has passed. They've been walking now for a month and a half. And during that time, it seems like the miracle at Marah with the wood and the bitter water is way in the back of their memory, because they grumble again. This time, though, it's about food. They make an astonishing comment to Moses. They say, life was better in Egypt, and God should have just killed them back there in Egypt rather than bringing them out here to the desert to starve. That's what I call the nuclear option. I've seen it in the context of the church. There was a time years ago when a family came to me very concerned about our youth leader. At a recent youth event, there was a competition where it was to see which student could drink a gallon of milk the fastest. Their son eagerly participated, and as he's guzzling this milk, he got to a certain point where he could go no further, and he erupted and vomited the milk all over the place. And so the parents were very upset at this. They were correct to be concerned. But they went from concern about that situation to saying to me, we're thinking about leaving the church. That's the nuclear option. Responding to a real, legitimate concern with an incredibly severe consequence. Israel does the same thing in Genesis chapter 16 when they don't trust God because they have seen the power and provision of God time and time again over the last few months. And then they get hungry, and just like that, they do a 180 and say, we were better off in Egypt. Why didn't God just kill us there? Whew. Well, having dropped that bomb on Moses, how is God going to respond? Again, he responds with amazing graciousness, famously providing them with manna and quail. I'm not going to retell that whole story. You can read Exodus chapter 16, but suffice it to say, God miraculously provides the people with food so long as they don't hoard. Just collect enough for each day, God says. And then on Fridays, collect extra so you'll have enough on the Sabbath day, Saturday. That way you don't have to work on the Sabbath. You can rest and trust in Him. But otherwise, they're going to need to trust in God daily, to provide daily bread. And God is teaching the people here, He is trustworthy. He will care for them. And they're to practice that over and over again every day. Well, it took some getting used to, the author tells us there in Exodus chapter 16, because some people did try to hoard. Some people did try to collect more than daily bread. Some people even went out on the Sabbath day to try and collect when there was none. And their disobedience, we learn, makes Moses very angry. But still we see the graciousness of God. Moses collects a small amount of manna to keep it for posterity's sake. He wants the people to always remember, even after this situation is long gone, that they can trust in God. Likewise, I encourage you to keep those remembrances. In my office, I have a bag hanging on one of the bookshelves from India. It's a reminder to me that God provided for my trip to India in 2023. Over my desk, there's a picture of a marketplace scene in Kingston, Jamaica, a reminder to me that God provided for my family when we lived there for a year. So how do you remember what God has done? Those remembrances help build up trust in God so that we can learn to turn away from these automatic responses of complaining and bitterness and create an automatic response of gracious, loving trust in God that leads us to follow His ways. So ask the people around you. Ask them to tell you, what are your automatic responses? Are you a complainer? Do you demonstrate bitterness? Dig deep. Is it possible that you have a deficiency of trust in God? What will it look like for you to create new habits? Trusting in God with hope and joy and love, even in the midst of difficulty.